So, I've got a wise guy on my hands in the comments section, and I thought I would deal with this in a unique way by peeking into my typewritten notes from my last video, so as to get right to the black and white of things while providing a little audience behind the scenes participation, I suppose you could call it. A little look-see at some of the juggling around that is sometimes involved when preparing something like this, while we discover who's the one that's not seeing the picture in its entirety. So we're looking at a screenshot of a block of text that I subtitled in bold as Recent Pullout. And I named it like that simply because it was the last chunk of copy that I pulled from the main body when I inevitably realized it was a sidebar that had not only pushed my time window too much, but had drifted too far from the main narrative. And what I've decided to do, just for fun, is begin this video here, even though I hadn't made any commitment to pick things up right at this spot in the next video, but we'll do it just for fun. Because, coincidentally, the pullout was yanked right from the spot where I'm told by the wise guy that I was doing just fine until it all fell apart by design because my profound shortfalls of wisdom are preventing me from seeing the true perils of communism and blah blah blah. But before we continue here, I'm going to jump to my notes of what was the final draft of commentary for that video, right to that spot. And so my line of words the wise guy is challenging is the second line there that reads, "No, because it's not the fault of the system, it's the lack of integrity of the individual." Although when recording, I improvised on the fly and said decidedly not instead of the word no. That's indifferent to the point.
But notice the line before it says, "But does all this mean we defund the police and classify healthcare as redundant?"
You see, I have said nothing about systems related to socialism or communism or capitalism, nothing of the sort. I was specifically referring to roles played in the vocations within our systems of law and order and healthcare. But hey, let's do it this way. We can overlay the video, rewind it back from the end, and then play it. But as it plays, what you'll also notice, what I've highlighted in yellow there, is a line that I dropped on the fly that I had left in there with the option to rephrase it. But I ended up dropping it because I just didn't want to go there and figured the previous line would clarify things enough. So here's the original audio with the video. But does this all mean we defund the police and classify healthcare as redundant? Decidedly not, because it's not the fault of the system, it's the lack of integrity of the individual. And in terms of healthcare, I'm talking about healthcare as a vocation and its corresponding principles and how an individual acts in defending said principles, and not what kind of healthcare system is intended on being administered. It's the individual aspect I'm focusing on. So there you have it, in an eggshell. Goodness me, that's why I used the illustration of the Eggman and the medical cross to distinguish a difference. What's more, I clarified it further and even intoned the line in somewhat of a preemptive fashion by emphasizing that I'm not talking about what kind of healthcare system. And one more thing you'll notice is I didn't use the word defund when I mentioned healthcare. I said consider it redundant, because I didn't want it to be saying anything about how healthcare is funded. Specifically done so to divorce the discussion from any socialist ideas, and by extension communist ideas. You know, for someone that wants to act like a wise guy, tooting his horn thinking he should be sitting in the engineer's seat, he sure has the uncanny ability to miss all the signs and signals along the shoulder that help keep the buggy on the right track. So now that we've established I'm not the one experiencing an eclipse on the full landscape, let's pick it up back at my pullout and further explore this discussion about systems and the individual. This propensity to exempt individual character judgment is honeycombing the structure of society. Sadly, it's pretty clear that people prefer it that way because then their own perseverance and moral courage never need come into question. It's merely the system's fault, or a certain gender's fault, don't you know? Similar to how people blame the system of capitalism instead of the character of the individuals involved. On the other hand, socialism is a system that deserves all the blame capitalism gets but doesn't deserve, and more because the system itself is inherently flawed. Now here we'll stop and ignore the rest of this commentary for now, so we're sort of editing on the fly here. But I do hope I emphasized that last sentence adequately for the wise guy, and I hope seeing it in black and white will help as well, just in case his ears were on autopilot. And I should also point out that I've focused on this issue of capitalism versus socialism fairly intricately in older videos, so it's not my fault if none of that sunk in. And I have focused on it intricately and will continue to, because it is so important, and in fact we could consider it as the keystone argument that is currently unzipping society right now. Because even the racism issue gets tied directly to capitalism, and they have the concept of racism so twisted and mangled out of shape now that it's become its own perverse reverse form of racism in the form of chants and screams and violence coming from a mob of people with a masochistic obsession with being a victim. It's capitalism that can't breathe. Capitalism is getting lynched because it's getting blamed for everything. And it's wrong.
Yes, it's wrong.
So it occurred to me here that since we're dealing with comments, the best way to do an autopsy on this entire discussion would be to exhume 2 screenshots I took of comments that were posted on one of my old videos. The first beauty I'll dig up is this one, in all caps of course.
Housing is a human right, you bourgeois fucktard.
Coming from someone that champions anarchy from the looks of it, so henceforth we can call him Captain Anarchy. What exactly a fucktard is would be anyone's guess. But the context that triggered his esteemed comment would be this scene here in the video where I was talking about this spectacle Jagmeet Singh and his ridiculous proclamations that housing is a human right. And with healthcare we see he's fervently jumping up and down promising free everything from head to toe. He's a philosophical parody and tragedy all in one. And with his most recent advocacy for this defund the police madness, he's proving he's not shy at all in showing just how dangerous he is. That said, I will reiterate and elaborate on a segment of what I said in that older video. And since it seems the current wise guy didn't listen then either, maybe he'll pay more attention here. I had pointed out that if one considers the statement the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the word pursuit was not superfluously put in there by the Founding Fathers. It was not just a fluky accident, it's an operative word that indicates that you have a right to pursue a livelihood and your shelter and personal property, and therein your happiness.
But careful, did your ears go on autopilot? I'm not saying money directly buys the said happiness.
Albeit, sleeping in a snowbank will likely not make you happy, but plenty of the people that live in mansions remain the miserable, spiteful assholes they were to begin with and are never happy even when they own 10 times the shit they need. The key point here is it's the right to the pursuit of happiness, not the right to happiness. There's a big difference. If the word pursuit was absent and it just said the right to life, liberty, and happiness, then the masses would be lining up at the White House door demanding their list of desires that they see will fulfill their statutory right to their guaranteed happiness. In fact, that's kind of what's happening now. And in further consideration to this, these rights have to be seen in the same fashion as I previously explained about charters for freedom of speech in my Canadian election videos, such that they are protections of these rights and not permissions being granted. You cannot protect a guaranteed happiness because there is no such guarantee, so one should exercise caution when hearing someone trying to persuade people otherwise. But that's the mentality that people like this clown here encourage and promise for people. Likewise with Captain Anarchy, but people like the Captain never absorb the points being outlined when they watch a video like mine because they have themselves convinced they don't need to. So it just sort of washes over them while they subconsciously filter out glittery words to later attack with all caps. So let's change the scene more in keeping with the discussion that will lead us to the second comment. Dave Rubin, whether you like him or not, spoke at a Maxine Bernier event during our last election cycle, and he passed a comment about free speech that I'm not so sure enough people saw the gravity of. He said something like, "You are entitled to free speech, but you're not entitled to a platform." Now this is a very significant statement, and I draw attention to it because it kind of mimics something Ayn Rand used to say that projects it even better as a visual concrete. She used to say something like, "You certainly have a right to free speech, but that doesn't mean someone needs to supply you with a printing press." Indeed, it's just like the right to defend yourself doesn't mean someone needs to hand you a gun and a lifetime supply of ammunition. Now that I've mentioned Ayn Rand, we can visit the second comment from Captain Anarchy.
Ayn Rand philosophy is distilled Judaism. We are social animals. The Jew wants to promote a system of capitalist elites. What a bourgeois parasite you must be. Do you get unearned money from property investments that you squeeze from working people? That is the kind of person who is an Ayn Rand fan.
Voila! Now I'm not just a bourgeois fucktard, I'm a bourgeois fucktard parasite that squeezes money from working people through my stately property investments. Ah yes, I'll get to those. The comment is great because it's so stupid, and we can talk about so many things with it. And it always escapes me why people like Captain Anarchy don't see their contradiction when it's right in front of their eyes. The captain demands that housing is a human right, while he simultaneously unites property ownership with that of the nature of a parasite. Interesting. It's the same old warped idea that it's somehow virtuous to receive something that you claim you should not need to work for and is therefore unearned, but if you procure the very same thing because you not only worked for it and earned it, but wanted to work for it and took pride in the work itself, it is somehow seen as greedy and nasty and parasitical. So twisted. The captain is the one demanding a guarantee he be accommodated with a roof over his head. He's the one with the parasitical premise motivated by a whimsical right to obtain the unearned. Sure, there are lots of property and business owners and landlords that are despicable, unscrupulous pirates that will exploit whoever they can. But that doesn't make the concept of property ownership or business or wealth or money the faulty components in the overall domain of things. It's the character of the person, the individual. Funny how that word keeps popping up. So all the captain's slick talk about distilled Judaism and capitalist bourgeois elites is nothing but flim-flam gibberish that's being regurgitated from the scribbles of some socialist quack. Look at it this way, Captain. The property rights follow the same principle as the previously noted rights about the printing press for free speech and a gun to defend yourself. The concept of property rights doesn't mean you have the right to be supplied with a house on some property. Furthermore, Captain, the concept of property in the context of property rights is different than just talking about land and houses. If I buy a jacket, it becomes my property. It is your right to pursue the ownership of property. You can't have genuine individual rights without property rights. Property rights are an intrinsic part of individual rights, starting with the clothes you wear. But you don't have a right to those clothes, you only have a right to pursue them. And that doesn't mean chase someone down and beat them senseless and steal their clothes. It means you either make them or work for them. And don't bother squawking about...
Babies have a right to have their clothes. What about babies, eh? Babies have a right. What about babies?
Babies are decidedly unable to pursue things on their own and need to be cared for. The captain needs to understand that human rights cannot include an aggregate of material needs despite their status as a necessity. Again, you have the right to pursue those needs, not a right to those needs. And that includes things like healthcare. With the fundamental rights of life and liberty, liberty is only a gateway to freedoms of choice in the manner of how one will begin pursuing one's needs. There is no guarantee of happiness, as I noted earlier, and aspects like being free from force of others and freedom of speech fall under liberty. But now the amusing part about an ignoramus like Captain Anarchy is that he immediately deduces I'm wealthy because I'm an advocate of the objective philosophy of Ayn Rand. Well, I've got news for you, Captain. My financial history has been chaos to the extent that I don't own a house or land. I don't even own a vehicle anymore, so I travel by transit. How's that grab ya? But this also raises another awkward problem here for Captain Anarchy. Because if I'm a financial wreck, shouldn't I hate the rich because I don't own a whole bunch of nice shit too? I certainly do hate rich companies the likes of Nike because of how they achieve the wealth, and thus in no way, shape, or form do they represent capitalism. But shouldn't I be on your side, Captain? Shouldn't I hate the rich because they're rich? And shouldn't I think Ayn Rand was nothing but a greedy douchebag or something? Or wait, maybe she was a fucktard and you just weren't around yet to let everyone know. What a shame. It throws a monkey wrench into the gears of your stereotype of the Ayn Rand fan, doesn't it? And I'll change the S in capitalism to a $sign just because I know it would piss off the captain. Because there's also another vital factor here that now steps into play. And it's more awkward news for the Capitan, I'm afraid. As I've already noted in previous videos, the predominant reason my life has been financial chaos is because of consequences paid for not surrendering myself to the engendered rule of thumb up the ass that if I value my job, I will learn to keep my mouth shut about my surroundings and behave like a mindless puppet that doesn't value his own ability or dignity. So, isn't this getting really interesting now? My life has been financial turmoil because I didn't capitulate to the kinds of people that you, Captain Anarchy, and so many other working people like you hate because they take advantage of the working people.
Well, so whose fault is that?
See where this is going, fucktard? And how it isn't looking too favorably for you or anyone else that thinks like you do. that think you know all about who's taking the idea of personal responsibility seriously, and who's standing up for what's right, and who's entitled to what, and what everyone needs to do to make changes in the system, and what exactly it is that can and can't be changed in this fucking world. It's actually the stark difference between you, Capitan, the social animal, chanting and stamping your feet while holding a union sign and blending in with a collective mob of other so-called working people, or the individual that stands one's ground in the range of the moment because one values the work that one can accomplish with one's own two hands right then and there. You talk about squeezing money from working people. Define working people. You take words like working people and have it settled in your mind that it means something consistent and reliable straight across the board. Ha, what a joke. As if all working people are credible just because they appear to be working. And I say appear to be because so many people prefer it that way anyway. I've seen the likes of you all through my life. You're in that class of previously described working people that relentlessly bitch about things while you're sitting in a lunchroom munching on your chicken because you know you'll never open your beak in the presence of the boss. And people like the captain commonly think the same way about healthcare as they do about housing. So let's duly jump to the discussion of healthcare and then orbit back around to the individual. And I'll begin by reflecting on something OWG said a long time ago in passing. To me, it's always been the things that OWG would say as a passing remark in his videos that would make me say out loud, yes! So one day he made a passing remark about healthcare and said something like if all the other garbage wasn't there, then people would be able to afford their own health insurance. And then he kind of mumbled it off and went on to talking about something else. Bullseye. If all the other garbage wasn't there. And I don't remember if he used the word garbage, but it's here nor there because it's the point of the matter. All the other government garbage, and there's piles of it. And since Trudeau's been on the scene, he's turned Canada into a landfill site like never seen before. If the garbage was removed, people would have more than enough money for their healthcare and likewise for housing. But the government garbage creates a financial squeeze, which, lest we forget, also includes all the money thrown away to other countries and stupid world alphabet institutions. And then they fancy themselves as the gallant heroes that come galloping in with promises of free head-to-toe healthcare and a supply of houses for the folks. And it's all wrong, because it just results in more garbage and more endless lists of bureaucrats sitting on useless committees arranging contracts handed directly to family and friends. Now, for some reason, some people seem to have difficulty conceptualizing what a society would be like if we removed the largest problems within it. And oddly enough, at the same time, they never fully conceptualize the very kind of system they think is ideal. But the fact of the matter is that the individual capitalistic system is the only system that is objectively sustainable. But let me approach it from the alternative direction, as that might help refine the point a little better. This moron is like Exhibit A because virtually everything he says is wrong. So, first of all, the whole idea of free healthcare does a disservice to the concept of the profession of health because it's saying it's not worth anything. Cheap equipment will do, poorly educated people will do, outdated facilities will do. It should just be free shit, man, right?
Hey, can't we just use a bunch of recycled milk cartons for beds and so on?
But of course they're hasty to intervene there and say,
Well, we don't really mean it's free, I mean it costs money, right? After all, that's why we're asking all the nasty rich people to pay for it.
Now here's a classic example where he's howling about how the system is rigged. But he's the one that actually wants a rigged system. He wants to set up a system that is dependent on all these super rich, the big greedy thieves, right? I find it strange that it never seems to matter where the money comes from, as long as it's coming. So again, he's the one that's rigging a system because he wants the healthcare to be dependent on a group of people that he encourages people to hate. It's almost as if it's their penalty because they shouldn't really have that money in the first place. And in so many cases it's true, but that doesn't matter, we just need it for our healthcare. So in essence, he wants a healthcare system dependent on capital that was acquired by unethical means and therefore shouldn't even exist in the first place. All you need to do is put the silliness to an illustration. So you hate the big bad greedy people that exploit the working people like a meat grinder to acquire their dark money, but think it's best to set up a healthcare system that's dependent on funneling that dark money that came from the big bad greedy people. Can't you see how rigged that is? How unethical it is, and how unsustainable it is in reality? Let's hypothetically say the big bad greedy people finally cleaned up their act, or better yet, people said no to working as a slave and forced them to clean up their act. They're likely not going to, but let's just say they did, because that's how it should be. And if people are going to fight for something, they need to fight for how something should be, how it ought to be, the difference between what is and ought to be. So if we remove the big bad evil dark money that shouldn't even be there in the first place, now what? How does the system sustain itself? Where's the money going to come from for the jamboree of healthcare and all the free eyeglasses that this meddling dirtbag wants to hand out?
Uh-oh. Oh, well, we can't do that because then it won't work.
Oh, but wait a minute. If we disposed of all the garbage of the government, people would have bathtubs full of money that would fill that vacuum. And if the big bad greedy people were deprived of slaves to use, then trade and commerce would gain some proper equilibrium. Speaking of slaves, we have crowds of people tearing down statues in protest to slavery, and 90% of them are wearing Nike gear. Go figure. It wouldn't surprise me if the Nike sweatshops already have their slaves pumping out cloth face masks that say, "Just do it." And so speaking of masked crowds, let's switch back and pick it up where I broke off from the pullout. Recently, this monster tried to give a little pep talk to the youth of Canada, I guess you could say, gushing with praise for how admirable their generation is, telling them how they get it and how they know what's wrong with the world and how to fix it. Is that supposed to be some new type of tasteless joke? They don't know what's wrong with the world and are equally clueless as to how to fix it because they listen to the likes of Trudeau and believe all the filthy lies and twisted ideas that flow from the hollow cavities of his empty skull. In the previous video series, I mentioned we've reached a tipping point, and we most certainly have, but it can also be seen from a perspective whereby we've reached a fork in the road. But not the traditional way you would think, where we now have two paths to choose from hereafter. It's this way. Because as a civilization, we've reached an intersection whereby two roads of ignorance have collided. One is a road of ignorance from an informational standpoint, and the other is a road of ignorance from a philosophical standpoint. It's like the start of a perpetual freeway pile-up of ignorance, everyone sleeping at the wheel. And when I say informational standpoint, I mean knowledge of what is actually happening in the world, and not your knowledge of something like the migratory habits of the Canada goose. If you challenge people on either of these standpoints with any confidence, you find that most people are completely bankrupt on both counts. Although it's a deeper hole of doubt on the philosophical page because most people snicker or sneer at a serious standpoint on philosophy, yet at the same time I marvel at how so many people love to paraphrase or throw around quotes of so-called philosophers, quotes that so often lead nowhere but to further doubt or dismissal.
Here, son, care for some Karl Marx on top of your bowl of nonsense?
And here's where I'll cut in with fresh dialogue, because this is where we are in our book of history. And I've got a wise guy that continually aspires to tell me after every video that I'm still in the fog, I'm not shrewd enough to see past the mirage of democracy, and I'm still missing that intrinsic piece of the puzzle that's restraining me from grasping the full depth of the philosophical nuances that behold the full canvas of the fucking picture. And you know what? I was eventually coming after you anyway, but had you not left that really idiotic comment on my last video that clearly showed you weren't paying attention to what I was saying, I likely would have toned down my wrath here. Because I'll tell you what, wise guy, the word communism isn't where the depth of the philosophy stops. As such, it's not the root of the problem. You seem to think I don't have a grasp on communism, when on the contrary I do, and more. Because the true poison in communism or socialism or fascism is altruism. And if we go one step deeper philosophically, the antecedent of altruism is the primacy of consciousness. And that brings us to the axiomatic level, but let's not go that deep yet, even though that's where we need to start in philosophy. We'll go there in later episodes. So for the time being, we'll step back up the philosophical tree to altruism. Because altruism is the poison that festers and eats away at the concept of self-sustaining action and life as an end in itself. Ayn Rand used to often remark that the greatest enemies of capitalism were those who claimed to champion it. And that's because she knew that altruism was the poison that was always eating away at it. And it still is to this day. And it's so often smuggled into discourse where people see it as innocuous. And a good example would be thinking back to our last election again, There was a farmer by the name of Frank Vaughan that was running as a candidate for the PPC. He seemed to be quite knowledgeable with farming and irrigation and advocated good work ethic, and he also championed the concept of the free market system, and those are all admirable standpoints. But where he went off the rails was when he started squawking on about how Maxime Bernier wasn't doing any of this for himself. He's not taking the risk of starting his own party for himself. It's a selfless act. He's doing it for you, the people. It's all about selflessness and sacrifice. And I remember he really stressed the whole selfless versus selfish gimmick, as is so often the case. And there's the lethality of altruism right there in your face. Now, some might not see that as important or even harmful or wrong, but it is more than you can imagine. You want to talk about being intimate with communism? Well, Ayn Rand also knew all about the cold, dark, deep, depressing blackness of communism. And when she finally managed to arrive in America and heard people always preaching about selflessness and sacrifice, she would experience a haunting wave of both alarm and revulsion as the horrors of communism would flash across her mind. And that's because she saw that the archaic, barbaric, and truly poisonous doctrines of self-sacrifice were being self-induced, as opposed to being forced at the point of a bayonet. And I'm going to revisit that exact point in a future video, pun intended. But so back to Frank, why is his discourse so wrong? It's wrong because the argument should be that Maxime Bernier is doing it for himself because he's not satisfied with what's happening and wants to change it. And so therefore he's standing for his principles, but not just because they're his, because he's established them to be correct. If someone is grandstanding policies that are not that of his own, then you know he's only trying to get elected, so then he'll just tailor his policies to whatever he wants anyway. I want someone in leadership that is pushing a given policy because it matches his own convictions. I've also pointed out before in videos that the whole altruistic gimmick of putting charity at the top of the hierarchy of values actually devalues the concept of individual merit because it's saying in order for there to be good, there first needs to be some suffering to tend to. It creates a mutually dependent but distorted and corrupt relationship. It handcuffs good with suffering, sort of like the rigged healthcare system Jughead Singh wants. It handcuffs greed and healthcare. We also see altruism rearing its ugly head today with the masks because they're trying to say you don't care about others if you're not wearing a mask. We see signs that say wearing is caring, trying to lay the guilt trip on you even though wearing is not caring. Wearing is saying, look at me, I'm a guinea pig that does whatever I'm told without any realistic consideration or objection. But you see, the gimmick is it's always about others. If your actions are for the sake of others, then you're noble. But if you're doing something for yourself, you're a selfish monster. Now, one of the barriers here is that people like Captain Anarchy think this is all saying that helping other people is not good, when that's just not true at all. That's why Ayn Rand deliberately chose The Virtue of Selfishness as a title for one of her handbooks, because she wanted to throw the word right back in the face of the acclimatized norm because she knew it was philosophically intimidating to people. Ayn Rand was the most brilliant philosopher that has ever lived, and she encapsulated it all best when she said, "To be or not to be is to think or not to think." These two roads of ignorance have finally collided, and there is no choice of roads, plural, to take herein, because the concept of going forward can only be charted as one road representing what ought to be. And the start of that is a vessel driven by individual determination for the preservation of individual freedoms, backed up by the confidence of fully understanding how to navigate that road and the moral courage to pursue it. The difference between what is and ought to be. Anything else is a blind turn off the edge of the abyss into the jaws of the moral feeding frenzy that's currently churning the waters. The only scenario where the concept of collectivism is valid is the concept of collectively acting as individuals. I'm all for that kind of collectivism. And people should want to know what's really happening in the world, and it truly blows my mind how many people prefer not to know and remain in their coma of ignorance. If you don't really know what's happening in the world and you're hypnotized by the media, then you can't know what's really wrong and are therefore handicapped by default to fix it and become part of the fucking problem. Likewise, philosophically. Worse yet, and some might remember my little monkey chart, All technology is doing at this point is speeding up the brainwashing cycle. As I noted at the time, a society that is making quantum leaps in technology while its state of ethics plummets in a fiery blaze can amount to nothing but doom. Just like the big X represents.